Welcome to another episode of The Breakdown. A little while back, we did a special for International Human Rights Day, and while all of the segments that were on that episode got a lot of really positive attention, there was one in particular that stood out a little bit, and that was the section on harm reduction that was done by Zoe Lambert. We've had more than a couple of people reach out and ask for us not only to put that video up separately, which we're going to do, but because of the amount of interest and because we've certainly seen lots of misunderstanding and lots of myths around harm reduction, we wanted to do a standalone episode with Zoe and sort of do a little bit more of a deep dive into it. So we're very, very grateful to be able to have a conversation today with Zoe Lambert, who is the owner of Abscission Wellness, and I had to ask what Abscission meant, so don't feel bad if you don't, and also quite a passionate harm reduction advocate. Zoe, thank you so much for joining us today.
Oh, thank you for having me.
So to start with, the video that you did for the special, I really can't call it a regular episode of The Breakdown because it really was something quite unique. The video that you did for that special really got quite a bit of interest, and I think a big part of that has to do with the fact that there's so many pieces of harm reduction, addiction treatment, that whole spectrum that are grossly misunderstood. So before we get into that, can you just tell our audience a little bit about who is Zoe Lambert?
So I've been working in social services for about 8 years. I've done multiple things in it. I've worked with refugees, immigrants. I've worked with people with developmental disabilities. I've worked with people who are having mental health issues, people who are in active addiction, people who are in recovery, and people who are experiencing homelessness. So right now, I'm currently not working with any agency. I have set up my own mental health wellness coaching because while working in the social services, there was a big disparity in people who want to get help and services actually available to them. There'd be a lot of clients who would be like, okay, this is the day, I'm feeling great, I want to reach out. And we would go and, either the hospital or Access Mental Health would put us on a 2-year wait list to get that mental health. And usually after that, they would, wait the year. And when they actually got in, it wouldn't be the day that they were actually wanting to get help. So it would lapse and we would have to start that process all over again. So I have currently set up a business to kind of fill in that gap so that I can work on a sliding scale basis and teach people maybe not that deep trauma work that therapy can provide, but at least give them day-to-day coping mechanisms and help them build healthy support systems around them so that at least we can lighten that day-to-day load while they wait for more, advanced services with a psychologist or a psychiatrist. I am currently trying to get into my master's of counseling so that I can eventually open my own practice as well. But just gaining experience, in the meantime.
Okay. So with the topic of addiction, that word is probably one of the biggest words in the English language, not by letter count, but by how much needs to be unpacked when we're talking about it. Because it seems like, and certainly based on the talk that you gave for the special, it seems like it's probably one of the most poorly understood concepts by the general public at the very least, in regards to sort of what drives it and in regards to what treatment modalities can or should look like. So to start with, when we're talking about addiction, let's go really basic. Are we talking about a lifestyle choice or is there something more to it than that?
Oh yeah, for sure. It is not a lifestyle choice, and I honestly think that we're indoctrinated into it at a very early age. If we think of our capitalist, consumerist society, we are constantly being told to consume, to consume, to consume, consume, to an unhealthy point, and really, that is addiction at its basis too, right? So it's a huge societal problem. We just have like, I guess, socially accepted addiction and then not socially accepted addiction. But really, addiction's anything that you consume habitually to a point that it's affecting your life negatively. And so when we think about that, we could think about shopping, right? You know, we have, I know I do for sure. I definitely shop my worries away, and that is addiction. Sugar is an addiction. Meth is an addiction. They're all on the same category and spectrum of what can be unhealthy. And I think that's kind of what bothers me when people, you know, outcast people with certain addictions, just because, you know, we're technically, as long as we kind of, you know, interact with the society that we're in, all of us have an addiction, whether it be little or to an extreme.
Do you think that it would be safe to say that the nature of addiction is at its core effectively a reward pathway that's gotten a little bit out of control?
For sure, for sure. And I think right now that's like we're almost like overstimulated as a society to have such I guess like to get that dopamine, we really need to work on it. And we see that within our social media platforms, right? Of us constantly scrolling or, you know, that, that is the basis of it is just this dopamine reward system. But I also think underneath that is a need to heal and a need to cope as well, right? So I don't think I don't think if you put a person and put them in a healthy environment with a healthy support system and give them a bunch of dopamine traps, whether it be, you know, meth, social media, whatever, with no stresses, that they would form addiction whatsoever. And that is, and that has been proven in the Rat City experiment, where they gave rats the option for cocaine and such. And when they put them in adverse experiences, the rats did a bunch of cocaine, but when they set up their cage to be like a rat paradise, basically, they didn't touch it. And I think humans act very similar, is that we lack this. Well, it's not that we lack the skills, we're not taught the skills to cope. That is never, you know, mentioned really in our educational systems whatsoever. And when we don't learn how to cope properly, then we seek instant gratification, and that is when that dopamine reward system really gets, you know, kind of out of control, right?
So one of the things that you talked about in your segment on the special was, and it goes with that reward system and the negative stimulus piece. But one of the things you talked about was the whole idea of it's very difficult, if not impossible, for addiction to exist in the absence of trauma. Can you talk a little bit about how trauma forms the foundation for addiction?
Oh, for sure. And the trauma is such almost like stigmatized word, and I don't think a lot of people understand that trauma is any prolonged, I guess, stimulation to our sympathetic nervous system, which is our amygdala, which is our just kind of flight or fight response, right? Again, it's not just for, war victims or victims of abuse. It could be someone experiencing a divorce or in the family, right? Someone experiencing a death of a close one, or even just going to school that you're bullied quite often, and such. And so that prolonged stress response releases a bunch of cortisol. And cortisol can help us get out of danger real quick. So we can't say that cortisol is just a horrible hormone, but it is when it is prolonged, and that is because it starts destroying integral parts of our brain, such as our prefrontal cortex, which is all our language, all our reasoning, our impulse control, our emotional regulation, also the hippocampus, which is learning and memory. And another part that I didn't mention in my speech is the corpus callosum, which is just a center to speak to other parts of the brain. It allows our brain to communicate with different sectors. And this destruction allows people just to be a little bit more vulnerable. Like if you have, low ability to control impulse control or your emotions, or to learn or to remember what you have learned, or for your logical brain to speak to your emotional brain, then with that fragmentation, it leaves people really vulnerable to high-risk behaviors such as addiction. And then unfortunately, when a lot of these high-risk behaviors increase the kind of that degrading of those brain parts, not only from, just like we think of prolonged drug use kind of destroying our brain, but we don't think about, getting in abusive relationships and that abuse continuing that cycle of trauma and continuing those destructions of those brain parts as well. Though speaking to codependency is kind of an addiction as well. So
Okay. Do you think that it would be fair? I mean, I think you're bang on when you say that trauma as a word is poorly misunderstood, and I think part of that might be because it's an incredibly broad word. I mean, when we're talking about trauma, we can talk about any of the examples that you use there, from divorce to abuse to you name it. But I think that there's my take, and I'd love to get your take on this, and please tell me if I'm wrong, because I am a lot. But my take on it is that it kind of sort of includes anything that's in any way a negative challenge or has a negative effect on a person's identity. I mean, we see this certainly with there's no shortage of oil field workers who have made work in oil and gas their identity, and they've suffered an injury while on the job that has prevented them from working. And so there's lots of examples where these oil field workers have been prescribed by a physician, perhaps inappropriately, medications that have higher addictive qualities. And in an effort to try to get back to the job or to stay on the job, these medications then get overused, they're not able to go back to work, and now we have somebody who's a full-blown opioid addict. So to me, it seems like the definition of trauma is difficult to define because it's so based on what's going to damage that individual's perception of themselves. Do you think that's fair to say?
I think that is fair to say. And I think it also, like, you do bring up a really good point that, so especially when speaking about the oil fields and up north and such, my fiance has gone up there. I know all about it. And it really is a place that brews isolation. And isolation is the huge part in trauma is, again, that's why most of my business is trying to develop healthy support systems, because you can experience so much adversity, but as long as you have people that love you, that are there to support you, it really cushions that brain damage that you have from that. So that is really the difference, right? So like we could have, an oil worker that, got laid off, maybe prescribed something for, chronic pain. And, he can be traumatized, yes, from that event, but that trauma stops once someone cares for him, once someone supports him, once he feels safe somewhere, right? And then we take another oil worker that got laid off that might be now addicted to opioids or, there's tons, benzodiazepines, amphetamines, ADHD medication, the list goes on. And if he comes home and there is no one to support, him or her, through this, that trauma just continues, because the worst thing about trauma is not really the event itself, it's going through it alone and unsupported. And that's when that damage really comes into place. And that's why I have such, I guess, angst, just pure angst and anger towards removing harm reduction, is because now we're allowing people to go through trauma alone and unsupported. And that is truly the real damage, right? And there's no way for an individual to take themselves alone. If I know a lot of people that kind of pushes against our ideology of individualism that we have here in Canada, and that, kind of that idea that, you can do everything alone, but you can't. Every thing that I have done in my life can be attributed to one person, at least one person, right? So I don't really understand how our government currently wants people that are that vulnerable to, get better alone.
So before we get into sort of what harm reduction is and how the UCP is in many ways working to dismantle it, the one other thing that I just want us to sort of touch on is, I think that part of the challenge, and this is another place where I'm going to ask you to tell me if I'm wrong, but I think that part of the challenge for a lot of people who don't have firsthand experience with addiction, or even secondhand experience with addiction, is that we tend to view other people's experiences through the lens of our own experiences. And when we're talking about trauma, it's not something that can be objectively, quantifiably measured. Like, I can't say that using you as an example in a totally unfair way, but I can't say that your trauma's a 4, and then it's now rated as a 4, and that's what it's going to be, because depending on who you are, what your life experiences were, what was going on when you were experiencing whatever that trauma was, it could be very, very different for some people than others. I think about my own profession, and I work as a paramedic. I've seen plenty of my coworkers experience calls that, to me, I would be able to walk away from relatively unaffected, but for them, it's profoundly affecting, and I work very hard not to watch them get affected and go, wimps, because they're experiencing that event through their lens, not my lens. And I think, to me, it's one of the really, really important things that we need to include in the conversation around harm reduction and addiction is the idea that I don't get to subjectively rate other people's trauma through my own lens. I have to be willing to listen to what their experiences are and how they affected them. Do you think that's a safe thing to say?
For sure. And I think you bring up the issue of resiliency, right? And that's a thing that we can't see and that we just assume that everyone has, right? And there are so many different types of resiliencies and factors. And that's why we again, our brains are very limited. I don't want to say that we're like stupid creatures, but damn, there's things in our brain that really do not work in our favor. And that, like, we make shortcuts, right? So we just assume a lot because to, think about all the individual factors of one individual situation at all time, it's overwhelming. We can't process that much information. So I think a lot of it is being aware of that shortcut, right? And just realizing that you are going to assume first that you have to use your controlled thinking to actually flush out the details, right? And not think in black and white measures. But going back to resiliency, I think, again, yeah, I grew up in a lot of trauma, a lot of prolonged trauma, and I also have complex post-traumatic stress disorder, which is why I'm so interested in this topic, I guess. And I grew up with friends that went through basically the same thing that I did, but came out just, not like they still experience trauma, still adverse experiences, but they came out, with adult skills and coping mechanisms that I never had and such. And I really had to struggle to learn all of that. And that was because, again, I had very little social support in my life, and they had a lot of social support. But, we also think of biological factors, right? Like mental health and addiction runs in my family. They might not run in that other family. That's also resiliency there. And a resiliency that we can't really change, unfortunately, just a biological basis. Then we have psychological. So, I see this a lot as well. A lot of people they don't, when they see me, they don't see that I used to, be in active addiction to amphetamines. They don't see that I, used to be, on the streets or, selling drugs whatsoever or fighting people. They're like, no, I don't see that from you. And they don't actually, a lot of people don't believe me that has happened because of the person I am today. And the only difference between a lot of, the clients that I used to work with who were in active addiction and experiencing homeless and me is just the fact that I was able to access certain systems while they were not. Right. And that's my resiliency. Right. And that is literally just pure luck on my side of things. And I just, that's why I can understand a lot of people who just like, like, again, a lot of people are like, why can't you just choose it? Why can't you just go through it? Right. And some people are just not that lucky, right? Some people are born in really awful situations. The stories that I have heard, I will never complain about my life ever again, because the trauma that's ensuing in our society is it's incomprehensible almost. And when you would meet those people, you wouldn't realize that, like, because it takes years to gain trust with people, to talk about their deep darkest secrets and traumas, that when you meet these people up front, you would never see that. You would never know what happened to them, right? And again, that's just black and white thinking. That's just our automatic thinking, making those mental shortcuts so that we can think easier. But we really have to take that second to be like, oh, wait, okay. So, like, my resiliency is very high because all of these things that I am very grateful and very lucky to have in my life. And, I shouldn't make other people feel bad that they don't have these things to be grateful about, right? Instead, I should role model or, help create those structures for them so they can heal themselves.
Okay.
Sorry.
No, that's fantastic. So with sort of a very basic cursory introduction to the nature of addiction and what drives it, let's talk about harm reduction. So if you could assume that we have people who are listening to the podcast from our audience of four, that have no idea what harm reduction is, how would you define harm reduction?
So harm reduction is, I guess, a collective structure of unconditional love. And that unconditional love is, telling people that, we understand, well, maybe we don't understand how you got here, but I'm going to sit with you, and we're going to take this journey together. And I'm not going to shame you for who you are, because I know that shame is huge in trauma, and that getting over trauma is not reliving or processing these memories. It's forgiving the person that you had to become to cope with it, right? So I'm not going to add shame to that. I'm going to try to take that shame off and try to understand how you got there and make you forgive yourself. And the biggest thing about harm reduction too is the fact that we need to keep these people alive while we're doing it, right? And they can't do it if they've injected with a dirty needle and now have hep C and are now focusing on their physical health, right? They can't do that if they're overdosing on fentanyl every couple days, and they have so much anxiety about dying and overdosing that they can't focus on forgiveness or acceptance or processing or actually using the resources that are available to them and such. So, and I truly think that harm reduction is the way to go for addiction, just because an abstinence-based approach is conditional love. We will only care for you if you are this person, right? And again, that puts a lot of shame into the individual. And it's also very black and white thinking. A lot of people who recover, right? We think recovery as abstinence based. It's not. Recovery is when your habitual use is not imposing negative consequences on your life. So a lot of people that I see are self-medicating. Especially so traumas, so PTSD is an anxiety disorder, and such. And when you have an anxiety disorder, you have a low GABA, and it's gamma aminobutyric acid, just basically something that calms you down. So your fight and flight go up, right? And GABA calms it down. It's like, no, all right, danger's end. So anxiety people don't have that GABA. So it's always like, right? We're not calming down whatsoever. And there's actually a lot of substances that give you GABA, and that would be marijuana, that would be alcohol, that would be cocaine as well, right? So a lot of people who are, drinking or in an active addiction is because it makes them feel better, because they're getting the neurotransmitters that they're lacking, right? So to be like, you need to just cut it out completely is it's just inconceivable, honestly, because it is helping that person on a baseline. And as long as I've met people who would have 1 to 2 drinks, which is low risk drinking, has little to no physical effects, such as damaging of the liver and such, and actually can help with your blood pressure. And abstinence-based treatment would be like, no, they're not in recovery, but they are, right? Because they are taking in charge in their life. They're doing it with intention and purpose, and they're being mindful of what they want and what they don't want. So
one of the comparisons, I mean, there's a couple of points that I still want to make before I let you go, but one of the comparisons that I've often heard people make in regards to addiction is that, and you were talking quite a bit about the brain remodeling that happens during trauma. One of the comparisons is to any number of chronic diseases. Probably the most common one that I hear is diabetes. In that, if somebody's a diabetic, they're almost certainly going to be some form of a diabetic for likely the rest of their lives. Now, neuroplasticity is pretty cool because over a longer period of time, you can get that more remodeling out of a brain than you can probably out of a pancreas. But the reality is that it's an organic condition that is going to require certainly a long period of management. Do you think that's a fair metaphor to use?
yeah, that is a fair metaphor to use. And like thank God for neuroplasticity. Like, it is wonderful that we can regroup our brains. But unfortunately, especially with long-term damage, our brains are never going to recoup the way that they were in their original state before the prolonged trauma or the prolonged drug use whatsoever. We will never be able to achieve that height of, I guess, intellectual capacity. Not saying that the brain isn't wonderful and that, that it won't compensate in other areas and such. But it is a lifelong thing. And it's, like, you need to, once you use a synaptic pathway, it gets easier each time, right? So even if, let's say, so I've been in recovery for quite some time, but let's say if I wouldn't, but decided to go out and do my drug of choice, right? That synaptic pathway is still there. It has not been pruned. So I am just choosing to use that one again, right? And then it's going to just get easier and easier. So that's kind of how abstinence-based logic is formed, right? Is that we need to prune those neural pathways that that we use while we're in active addiction and such. But a lot of people can still weaken, like, it depends on how much control and like impulse control you have. And again, that prefrontal cortex thing, because I know a lot of people that I've worked with who have been in active addiction have, weirdly smoked crack on Tuesdays and have been fine right after that, like have, are in control of their life, right? I don't understand it, but it's working for them, right? So, they just have better impulse control than my brain. And that's the thing. Every brain is different, right? And that's why trauma kind of shows itself in many ways, right? There's many kind of trauma related mental health disorders, such as, dissociative personality disorder, borderline personality disorder, bipolar, schizophrenia, all just kind of different, I guess, DNA, DNA, I guess, showing us how the trauma affected us, right? So it's hard to kind of give it, again, what you've said, an overlapping kind of definition of, can people recoup their brains? Some people probably can, right? Maybe not to the original level, but then there are some people who have either genetics or, a long time, a prolonged trauma, that it's going to be super difficult to get it even close back to that original state. So it is a constant, it's a constant thing that needs support. And that's with opiate use disorder, like it's been proven that it's a chronic relapsing disorder. And that's why, right? And that's why harm reduction has to be there. So
it's one of the ways that I've always found it interesting to think about is the whole idea that if you've got a brain that's designed to seek reward pathways, and I think the physiology is pretty clear on that, for somebody who has established reward pathways that have to do with substance use or gambling or high-risk behavior, we'll just put it under that whole umbrella, when they go through periods where they're the new ways to meet those reward pathways aren't there, whether it's the end of a relationship, whether it's some instability in the job, their brain is going to push them to still find those reward pathways. And so your point about how once that pathway's there, it's there. To me, it seems that a person who's dealing with addiction and recovery is always going to have to contend with that sort of, if things get crappy, my brain's going to go, it'd be really nice right now, and it's going to be whatever that high-risk behavior is. Let's talk a bit about the supervised consumption sites.
okay.
So supervised consumption sites have certainly been a contentious topic. I'll tell you, my take on it is that a big part of the reason why they're so contentious is because A, they're poorly understood, and secondary to that, again, going back to kind of what we talked about earlier, it's if I'm viewing a supervised consumption site, and I've never had any troubles with addiction, I've never had any significant interactions with people who have dealt with economic adversity or homelessness or list. It's very easy for me to look at it only through my, I'll use the word privileged lens, and go, I don't need that. They just need to pull themselves up by their bootstraps. And clearly that's flawed. That's a flawed mentality. What do you see as the value of supervised consumption sites? And if you could get people who approach supervised consumption sites with that external view to look at it a different way, what would that way be?
Okay, so the value of supervised consumption sites is just the fact that, like, in Vancouver, their supervised consumption site, that it's a community center for junkies. But I do agree with it, because in my not in my last speech on human rights day, but in the one before that, I was speaking about Maslow's hierarchy of needs, right? And so again, those people that are like, just pull up your bootstraps, right? They're talking about self-actualization, and that's the top. That's our, best selves, right? But there's a bunch of needs that need to be filled below it to get to that top self. And first of it is food, right? And a lot of these safe consumption sites are the only places that people eat for the day, right? Food, water, right? In warmth are in there. And there's a lot of, why can't these people access other places for food and warmth? Because there is multiple resources, but a lot of places won't accept people who are intoxicated into their facility. So it is literally sometimes the only place they can go. And then there's safety and security also in those basic needs as well. And, again, that safety that you can come here and we will protect you, right? That you will not die on our watch, because we are here, we're trained, right? Again, it's really hard to self-actualize and be your best person if you're constantly worried about overdosing and dying. But then there's a second tier, which is psychological needs. And that is belonging. That is that we need to feel like we belong somewhere in order to become our best selves. And right now, people in active addiction don't belong anywhere. They don't belong on our streets. They don't belong, in our malls. They don't belong even in their safe consumption sites, apparently, right? And it's literally a community, again, of unconditional love and support, right? That doesn't even support them only on a, like keeping them alive level. There's biological, there's doctors, right? That, let's get your health in order. There's psychological, there's peer support workers, there's psychologists, there's psychiatrists, there's societal. So if you're in poverty, well, let's get you housed, right? I know where to get clothes, and, the works and such. So all those needs need to be met. And if we don't have a safe consumption site where people feel like they're belonged, or like have a sense of belonging, or feel like they're wanted, we're taking that step away, right? And then it's impossible for them to get to the top of the pyramid if we're taking steps away from them, right? Like but also, like, I feel that safe consumption zones, the biggest problem is that it wrecks the community around that safe consumption site, right? And it's bringing crime, it's bringing drug use into downtown, which has always been. But I'll humor them. So let's take it even further. Let's say that we can train any doctor with the skills of harm reduction, right? So that, I am in active addiction. Let's say my drug of choice is opiates. I can go into any walk-in clinic and be like, hey, can I inject this here? And can you keep me safe? Right? And that doctor will be trained. And yes, you can, right? And, if after we want to talk about mental health resources, or if you want to see, again, there's a lot of walk-in clinics that now have a psychologist. If we could add a social worker to every clinic as well, so that they can, refer it to the psychologist, to the social worker. And that's when people are going to get a real sense that they belong in their community, when everyone's looking out for them.
One of the things that's striking to me about the supervised consumption sites is the fact that, I mean, even if you remove the just deal with it argument, and they should just pull themselves up by their bootstraps argument, even if you remove that, which to me is fundamentally flawed, because as soon as you say, here's what I think you should do for your addiction, I'm using my experiences and my lenses to say what's going to work best for you, even though I may not know very much about you at all as an individual. So to me, it's flawed right out of the gates there. But the thing that trips me up the most is why people are resistant to supervised consumption sites is, if you take a look at the costs that are involved from a purely economic standpoint, if Timmy goes into a supervised consumption site, overdoses, the staff there can use a Narcan kit that costs dollars to reverse that. They can give them some oxygen to reverse that, hypoxia being the number one thing that causes death in opioid abuse. But if Timmy doesn't have that supervised consumption site, now he's doing that out on the street or at home. And now the $5, $10 cost for that Narcan turns into a $500 to $600 cost to the taxpayer for an ambulance ride, which then turns into a several $1,000 assessment and observation in the ER, which, if Timmy was lucky and he didn't suffer too much of a hypoxic injury, he's then able to go back out on the streets. But if he's not lucky, he's going to spend some time in the ICU, which is only going to cost more and more and more money. So even if we ignore the best evidence on addiction treatment, even if we ignore the best evidence on the statistics for supervised consumption sites and them being able to move people into treatment pathways like you were talking about, from a strictly fiscal approach, it just makes more sense. Why do you think people can't get to a place? I mean, there's even the arguments, like you mentioned, the increased crime. I mean, those are mitigatable using a model, whether it's using walk-in clinics, or, I mean, Calgary was looking into portable supervised consumption sites with a bus for a while there. Why do you think people are so resistant to admitting that they're wrong about the way that they think about addiction?
It's using the same brain pathways that almost cause addiction. It's fear-based thinking, right? It's very ironic. So it is fear-based thinking, and it's that black and white, us versus them mentality, right? And I find the people that have the biggest I guess, resilience or resistance against, supervised consumption sites or harm reduction have been hurt in the past by an addict. And, a lot of that, again, there's the trauma right there, right? So they have been hurt by someone with addiction, or someone they knew was hurt by someone who is in active addiction. So now this trauma that we've had integrates into our personality, and to keep us safe, we think in black and white terms, right? And that's not always particularly bad, such as like leaving an abusive relationship. We have to think in black and white, right? We have to think our ex is awful. We cannot have that gray area, because then we might go back to them, right? And we might hurt ourselves again. And our brains are really great in protecting us with that and such. But I think that's a lot of why people can't see the gray in addiction, is because I've been hurt by that. So I need to think in black and white to protect myself from that. Right. And I think it's also isolation. So like we think of prejudice and stereotype and how it's formed, and it is that us versus them mentality, but it's also a lack of exposure to whatever group you're stereotyping or holding prejudice to. And like our city is not, like, I think about this often, and I don't have a solution whatsoever. But we isolate, so there's homeless shelters, right? And that's where all the homeless people go, right? There's addiction centers, and that's where people with addiction go, right? And it's separated from the general public, right? It's almost like it's almost like we're repressing our subconscious problems and they're coming back up, right? As they always do. And we need to learn a way to expose the general public to people with addictions. So, because exposure theory is the best theory against prejudice and stereotyping. And that's just interaction, right? That's why people, who have been Black have infiltrated the KKK and been able to actually get people to step down, right? It's because once they realize who they're talking with, once you put a face, you can have all these stereotypes like, oh, they chose it, right? They're a bad person, all these excuses for why we don't like this person, right? But it's really hard once we start befriending people to hold those opposite views, right? We have to let one go, and usually it's the maladaptive negative views that we have on that person. Again, and I think that does really put that, like, these people should be welcomed in all of our communities and such, and so that there is interaction with people, right? They don't have to go into some secluded place, right? Because that just develops more stigma, more isolation to the matter, and doesn't produce any understanding or compassion, right? Whether it's community centers in which everyone can come to and learn about coping mechanisms, and it's free, so everyone can interact, we can talk to each other, right? We can grow together. I'm not quite sure, but the system that's going on is creating an even bigger divide between people.
And I think at the end of the day, I mean, one of the arguments for the supervised consumption sites, and you mentioned this in the segment that you did on the special, is at the end of the day, you can't help someone who's dead. And if I mean, one of the jokes that I'm most fond of is the how many psychiatrists does it take to change a light bulb? Well, only one, but the light bulb's got to want to change. And I think that applies very heavily to addiction treatment. And again, please correct me if I'm wrong, but it seems to me that if you're trying to force help on somebody who's not at a place where they can accept it yet, that help will not be effective. And so if that's where that person's at, the question then becomes not how do we force help on this person in the way that we want them to accept it, because it's just not going to work, to, okay, well, how do we bridge the gap between where they are right now and where they are, helping them get to a place where they will be able to accept that help. And especially when we're talking about opioids, where the potential from death from overdoses is much higher than a lot of other high-risk behaviors or drugs. If we don't fill that gap with something, then that gap gets filled with bodies.
Yeah, that's exactly it. And yeah, so sorry, there's a lot to dig through for what you just said. So yes, you cannot, like, that's the number one thing you learn from helping people, is that you don't really help them change whatsoever. You support them so they can help themselves, right? And again, I said harm reduction is the basis of unconditional love, right? And unconditional love means that there's no shame, right? And that's shame is such a huge thing where it just deteriorates our self-worth and, our self-confidence. It makes us feel bad for how we cope. It makes us feel like we deserve to be where we're at, right? We deserve to be in active addiction. We deserve the suffering. We deserve, our toxic relationships. But that's where harm reduction comes in with its unconditional love. If we can take away that shame and be like, no, it's okay. We're going to stay with you no matter who you decide to be or what you decide to do. We're going to stick there, right? We can kind of show them what a healthy relationship is, right? Because healthy relationships don't put conditions on people they love. We understand that they're always changing. And even if there's a phase that we go through, that we can help support people to work through it or to get out of it, right? And within that, we build people's self-worth and self-confidence. And once we build that, and I know this from experience, you realize that like, hey, I am worth it. I am worth taking the time to go to treatment. I am worth, not putting up with the toxic relationships that constantly make me inferior. I'm worth, getting up and brushing my hair, right? And brushing my teeth. Like it's that self-worth and that self-confidence that is like the embodiment of harm reduction, right? Like that's what we're trying to do. We're not trying to, kill these people. We're not trying to, inject them with drugs. That's not it. We want to make sure that they're alive so that we can care for them the way that they haven't been cared for ever, obviously, in their life, so that they can feel wanted, belonged, and they can feel like they can relax, right? They can be like, okay, I've been holding all this shame and resentment and, self-hatred in myself. And like, maybe I don't need to hold this because no one around me reflects that, right? We are who we are around. Like, if we decide to just leave people in these isolated groups of addiction, they're just going to reflect behaviors towards each other. We need to stop that and reflect another behavior, right? It's modeling. It's basic modeling, right? We need to model healthy relationships, healthy coping mechanisms, and healthy structures of care before these people can build self-worth so they can, again, if they want to go into abstinence-based care after that, I'm all for that. I'm not against abstinence-based treatment whatsoever, right? But I just realized that they have to make that choice, and I want to be there to support them through their journey of making that choice, whether they do it or not, right?
Mm-hmm. I think it's really important to highlight the fact that there is not one cookie cutter solution to managing addiction, because it seems like that's a big part of what the current provincial government is trying to pursue. Do you think? I mean, in listening to you speak here, I'm struck by the fact that the path that the current provincial government seems to have taken is one where they're almost saying, we're only going to provide you with supports if you behave the way that we want you to behave.
Right? Yeah.
Doesn't that just cause more damage? Because if these people aren't in a place where they're able to accept that or do that, saying, well, if you can't do that, then you're not worth our time. To me, that only exacerbates the trauma.
Yep, and adds more shame to that individual, so they're more likely to not seek help, to do those self-destructive things, like, right? Like, we are literally society. the government is making society exclude them, so that self-hatred is just going to go much deeper, right? And yeah, like, oh, sorry, Jason Kenney, that guy. He has said, they like, again, that we tell our clients that there's they don't have more like good moral agency over their addiction. And like, there is no moral agency in addiction. It is not a choice. That has been proven, right? Like, that is proven in multiple academic journals, right? So I don't know what he's talking about whatsoever. And I don't think he does either. But like like just the fact that he is wanting people to use their moral agency to get out of addiction is not scientifically backed and impossible to do, right? Because it's not moral agency that made them choose addiction whatsoever. It's just very uneducated and damaging. As you said before, when we take this view, not only do people feel rejected by society, and that self-hatred fuels more drug use because they're trying to cope from, their feelings of rejection, of isolation, of just, devastation. But people are going to die. Like, that's the unfortunate. It's not just an uneducated opinion. It's an uneducated opinion that's going to lead to more deaths in an already vulnerable population. And as in the beginning, I said, grief of a loved one dying is trauma, right? And that's prolonged trauma. So we're just traumatizing them and perpetuating trauma within that community, and then looking at them and being like, well, just pull up your bootstraps and get better, right? And it's what?
Well, and it's fascinating to me that that whole moral agency line. I'm not even going to call it an argument because it's just so much bullshit. But that whole moral agency line, I'm curious if Mr. Kenney would say too, given that we've established that there's a physiological organic component to addiction, whether we're talking about the brain part or whether we're talking about the sheer physical part. I mean, if anyone who's ever seen a hardcore alcoholic stop drinking, no, you can't watch that process where they're having seizures and DTs and all of that and go, it's just a choice. It's all in their mind, because it has a very real impact on their body. And I can't help but wonder if Mr. Kenney would say to people who are facing diseases like cancer or like Parkinson's or like any other organic process, and say, you know what, if you just had stronger moral agency, this wouldn't be happening to you.
Exactly. And that's what I said with my last speech as well, right? Like, that he would not go to someone with schizophrenia and be like, just use your moral agency and you'll be able to cure yourself. It's ridiculous. And unfortunately, just every attack that he's had against it, he's like, oh, but this, he said that it was offensive that a reporter asked him why he wasn't going with harm reduction, even though it's evidence-based treatment, because a panel of experts made that decision. But like, the unfortunate part of that panel of experts was it was all abstinence-based experts, no harm reduction, even though they had a Chinese medicine specialist on there, right? Like, okay.
I have to really sort of question the use of the term experts when at least one of them didn't know that you can't ask an unconscious person if they want oxygen.
Right. Like, it baffles me. And then it's also like, obviously he just picked people so he can create an echo chamber of his own thoughts, right? His own uneducated thoughts. And I feel like that really isn't democracy, or like informed, like collective decision on how we're going to move forward with this topic. But that's a whole other issue.
When we come to the end of these interviews, I always like to ask the guest if there's anything that they'd like to say to a group. I'm going to do things a little bit differently today. And I'm going to ask you if there's what would you like to say to people who are dealing with addiction, and what would you like to say to the people who just believe that people need to pull themselves up by their bootstraps? So those two groups, I imagine you're going to have very different messages for. But what would you say to people who are struggling with addiction right now?
To forgive themselves, honestly, to realize that coping mechanisms, are there to protect yourself, right? And that we should not feel guilty for the coping mechanisms that we choose to take care of ourselves. We just need to realize that there's pros and cons to each coping mechanisms, and we want to bring the best forward to us, right? And that, regrowing brain neural pathways is a process. It's not something that's going to be instant, and it's going to be a lot of struggle. It's going to be a lot of relapse. That doesn't mean it's not worth it. And that we need to start lightening up on ourselves, right? That we can only heal through self-love and not through self-hatred, right? So let's say, actually really real example. So when I was in recovery, I relapsed quite a bit. And when I hated myself for it, I would relapse even further. I'd be like, oh, fuck it. This is just who I am, right? Like just going to go off the deep end with it. But when I learned self-love, I realized that even if I could go 24 hours without using, that 24 hours counts, right? That counts to my better future, right? Even if I used after, I still did 24 hours, right? And that all adds to the equation of a better life. And always just telling myself when I messed up that I must have needed it. There must have been stress that I couldn't cope with. So I knew how I did what I knew how to do, right? And there should be no hatred or shame in that. That is just, normal human functioning. We always need states of equilibrium, right? Even though sometimes we don't know the best way to get it.
Okay. And what would you say to the Jasons, the Jason Luans, the Jason Nixons, and the Jason Kenneys?
Again, I would hope that to expose yourself, like just go out, like have some humility. Have some humility that maybe you don't know what is going on, right? And you don't have a full picture. And the only way that you can get that full picture is by, either researching it or going out and talking to people who have either recovered from active addiction or are in active addiction. Just because that way we can't assume anything, because we have things that are actually in our reality that we are getting our information from, not the media, not whatever opinions I can think up, right? And that's really, again, the basis of all of healing is to unisolate, unindividualize ourselves, and actually work as a community together. So just hold up assumptions, just be like, oh, I'm assuming, right? I don't actually have, any kind of clarity or research behind this thought. So maybe I should seek out more clarity, whether that be right now via the internet because we're in COVID and everyone's isolating. But once this is over, maybe, to volunteer at the drop-in center just for one day, right? And see where it goes.
Mm. I want to thank you again so much for being so generous with your time. I want to thank you for your advocacy on these issues. Addiction is to me one of the most poorly understood concepts that's out there, and unfortunately we see politicians and people of other stripes who are more than happy to exploit people's lack of understanding of it for their own ends, and I think it's really unfortunate because it does come with a huge human cost. So thank you for your advocacy and trying to raise awareness. If it's okay with you, what we're going to do is we're going to post this episode, and then at the same time we're also going to post the segment that you did for the special. So that people have both that they can refer to if they want to listen to almost an hour and a half of conversation on and information on addiction and harm reduction.
Yes, nope, that would be lovely. The more information out there, that's what I'm hoping, is just for more informed people, right?
Awesome. Well, thank you so much again, and hopefully we'll be able to have you on again in the future to touch on some more of the stuff. Because if human history has taught us anything, this is not a challenge that's going to go away.
Nope, definitely not. Thank you so much for having me. You have a wonderful day.
And that's it for another episode of The Breakdown. Now, we want to just take a quick sec to remind you that we're only able to produce the kind of content that we do because of the support that we receive from our Patreon supporters. So if you appreciate the kind of content that we're trying to produce here, please consider signing up to be one of our Patreon supporters at www.patreon.com/thebreakdownab. And if you're listening to the audio version of our podcast, please consider leaving a rating and a review, because it's those things that help us to get the podcast in front of more and more people. And as always, thank you very much for your time.